The Tonight Show studio hummed with its usual Wednesday night energy as Margaret Chen walked onto the stage, her gentle demeanor and observant eyes reflecting 18 years of stepping into different classrooms and quickly assessing the needs of students she would know for only days or weeks at a time. At 56, Margaret moved with the adaptable confidence of someone who had mastered the art of making immediate connections and lasting impacts. Her warm smile carrying the wisdom of thousands of brief but meaningful encounters with young people. Jimmy Fallon stood to greet her, immediately struck by Margaret's calm presence and the way she seemed to radiate the patient energy of someone who had spent nearly 2 decades being the consistent adult in constantly changing educational environments. Margaret wore a professional navy blazer over a soft gray blouse, clothes that reflected her role as the reliable substitute who could step into any classroom at any grade level and carried a well-organized messenger bag that had obviously been her companion through countless schools and teaching assignments. "Margaret Chen, everyone," Jimmy announced as the audience applauded warmly. Margaret just retired after 18 years working as a substitute teacher throughout the Los Angeles Unified School District. Margaret, welcome to the Tonight Show. Margaret settled into the guest chair with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to quickly adapting to new environments, her hands resting calmly on her messenger bag as she offered the audience a genuine smile that spoke to years of winning over skeptical students. "Thank you for having me, Jimmy. I have to say this is definitely the most attentive audience I've had in a while. Much better than trying to teach algebra to 37th graders on a Friday afternoon." The audience responded with appreciative laughter, and Jimmy leaned forward with genuine curiosity about this woman who had dedicated her career to one of education's most challenging roles. 18 years as a substitute teacher? That's incredible dedication, Jimmy said. "I can't imagine how difficult it must be to constantly walk into new classrooms, new schools, trying to connect with students who don't know you and might not want to cooperate with the substitute." Margaret's expression grew thoughtful, and she placed a protective hand over her messenger bag. "You know, Jimmy, most people think substitute teaching is just about maintaining order and following lesson plans until the regular teacher returns, keep the kids quiet, hand out worksheets, survive the day without any major incidents." "But it's more than that?" Jimmy prompted, sensing there was something deeper behind Margaret's words. Margaret was quiet for a moment, her eyes taking on the focused look of someone who had spent years observing and analyzing human behavior in its most unguarded form. "When you work as a substitute teacher, you become a unique kind of outsider. Students don't see you as their real teacher, so they often behave more naturally around you. You get to see things that their regular teachers might miss. The social dynamics, the struggles, the talents that haven't been recognized." The studio grew more attentive, the audience beginning to understand that this wasn't just going to be a story about classroom management, but about human observation and intervention. "About 2 years into substituting, I had an experience that completely changed how I understood my role," Margaret began, her voice taking on the careful tone of someone who had told this story before but never lost sight of its significance. "I was covering a 5th grade class for 3 days, and I noticed this one student, David, who never participated in discussions, never raised his hand, and seemed to shrink into himself whenever attention was directed toward him." Margaret's eyes grew more focused as she recalled the memory. "But during independent work time, I walked around the classroom and saw that David's math work was not just correct, it was sophisticated. He was solving problems using methods that were well beyond 5th grade level, creating elegant solutions that showed genuine mathematical thinking. Jimmy felt a chill of recognition, understanding that this observation was leading somewhere significant. When I asked David about his work, he just shrugged and said he didn't want the other kids to think he was weird. Margaret continued, opening her messenger bag slightly. That's when I realized that in just 3 days as a substitute, I had identified a gifted student who was hiding his abilities to fit in, something his regular teacher hadn't noticed in months of working with him. The audience listened in respectful silence, sensing they were hearing about something deeply important. Margaret pulled a thick folder from her bag, revealing it was filled with detailed notes, observations, and documentation. So, I started what I privately called my Student Insight program. Every time I substituted at a school, I would spend the day not just teaching, but really observing the students, looking for patterns, needs, and abilities that might not be obvious to their regular teachers. She opened the folder, showing pages of careful handwriting organized by school, grade level, and date. I began documenting everything I observed. Students who seemed to be struggling academically, but showed intelligence in non-traditional ways. Kids who were being bullied or socially isolated, children who displayed signs of problems at home, and talented students who were flying under the radar. Jimmy looked at the detailed documentation with growing amazement. Margaret, this is incredible. You essentially became a detective for student welfare. Margaret's face lit up with quiet pride and determination. That's exactly what I became, Jimmy. Because as a substitute, I had a unique perspective. I could see each classroom with fresh eyes, without preconceptions about individual students. And I could observe social dynamics without being invested in maintaining existing classroom hierarchies. She flipped through several pages of her folder. Over 18 years of doing this, I estimate I created detailed observation reports for about 800 students across dozens of schools. Each report contained specific information about academic abilities, social challenges, emotional needs, or behavioral patterns that seemed significant. The studio audience began to murmur in amazement, and Jimmy felt a profound sense of awe at the scope of Margaret's secret mission. But Margaret, Jimmy said gently, what did you do with all these observations? How did you help these students when you were only in their classrooms temporarily? Margaret carefully selected a specific section of her folder. That was the challenging part, Jimmy. I couldn't directly intervene in most cases because I wasn't their regular teacher, but I developed a system for making sure my observations reached the right people. She showed him pages of typed letters and reports. I would write anonymous letters to school counselors, principals, and regular teachers describing specific students who I believe needed attention. I never identified myself as the source of the information. I just provided detailed observations and suggested areas for follow-up. Margaret's voice grew more passionate as she explained her process. For David, the gifted math student, I wrote a letter to the school counselor describing his advanced abilities and suggesting he be evaluated for the gifted program. I included specific examples of his work that I had documented during my 3 days in the classroom. Jimmy felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as he absorbed the thoughtful care Margaret had taken. Did your anonymous intervention help David? Margaret's face lit up with joy. 6 months later, I was substituting at the same school and learned that David had been placed in the gifted program and was thriving. His confidence had improved dramatically, and he was finally in an academic environment that challenged his abilities. She turned to another section of her folder, but that was just one case. I documented bullying situations and reported them anonymously to administrators. I identified students who seemed to be struggling with undiagnosed learning disabilities and suggested evaluations. I noticed children who showed signs of abuse or neglect and made anonymous reports to appropriate authorities. The studio was completely absorbed now, many clearly moved by Margaret's dedication to advocating for students she barely knew. "Can you give us another specific example?" Jimmy asked. "What was one of the most significant interventions you made?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, then reached for a section that was clearly special to her. There was a middle school where I substituted regularly, and I kept noticing this 8th grade girl named Sarah, who was incredibly articulate and insightful during class discussions. But her written work was almost illegible, and she seemed to struggle with basic assignments. Her voice grew more thoughtful. After observing Sarah in 3 different classes over several months, I realized she showed classic signs of dyslexia, brilliant verbal processing, but significant challenges with written expression. However, she had learned to compensate so well that her regular teachers assumed she was just lazy or careless. Margaret found the relevant documentation in her folder. I wrote a detailed letter to the school psychologist describing specific examples of the disconnect between Sarah's verbal abilities and written work and strongly recommending a learning disability assessment. Jimmy leaned forward with deep interest. "What happened with Sarah?" "The evaluation revealed severe dyslexia that had gone undiagnosed for years," Margaret replied, her voice filled with satisfaction. "Once Sarah received appropriate accommodations and support, her academic performance transformed completely. She went from barely passing to honor roll within 1 semester." Margaret's eyes grew moist with emotion. 2 years later, I received an anonymous thank you note from someone who signed it, Sarah's mom. She wrote that the assessment had changed her daughter's entire educational trajectory. In self-image, Sarah had gone from thinking she was stupid to understanding that her brain just worked differently. Jimmy was openly moved by the profound impact of Margaret's careful observations and anonymous advocacy. "How did you manage to keep track of all these students across so many schools?" Jimmy asked. "The organization and follow-up must have been enormous." Margaret nodded, flipping through her systematic documentation. "It was a lot of work, but I developed efficient systems. I kept detailed files organized by school and date, with follow-up notes about interventions I had made and outcomes I had learned about." She showed him a section filled with color-coded notes and cross-references. "I also built relationships with counselors and administrators at schools, where I substituted regularly. They began to trust my observations and would sometimes seek my input on difficult cases, not knowing I was already providing anonymous intelligence about student needs." Margaret's voice grew more emotional. "What I discovered is that many student problems are actually quite visible if you know what to look for, and if you're observing without the bias of long-term relationships or preconceptions." Jimmy was deeply impressed by the sophistication of Margaret's approach. "Did any schools or teachers ever figure out that you were the source of these anonymous reports?" Margaret smiled with obvious warmth and slight mischief. "That's one of the most interesting parts of this story. After about 10 years of this work, I started receiving requests from principals asking specifically for me to substitute in classrooms where they were concerned about particular students." She paused, then continued with growing emotion. "Eventually, I realized that some administrators had figured out that whenever I substituted at their schools, they would mysteriously receive insightful, anonymous reports about students who needed attention. They never confronted me directly, but they began using me as an unofficial diagnostic resource." Jimmy was fascinated by this unofficial recognition. "So your substitute teaching became a specialized service for identifying student needs?" "Exactly," Margaret replied, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "By my last few years of substituting, I had developed relationships with dozens of schools where counselors would quietly brief me on students they were worried about, and I would spend my substitute days conducting focused observations. She pulled out a final section of her folder, this one containing thank you letters and success stories. These are some of the outcomes I learned about over the years. Students who received help because of anonymous reports that traced back to my observations. Margaret selected one letter and read carefully. This is from a high school counselor who wrote, "To whoever has been providing detailed student observations over the past several years, thank you. Your anonymous reports have helped us identify and assist over 30 students who might otherwise have fallen through the cracks. Your insights have prevented dropouts, identified learning disabilities, and connected struggling students with resources they desperately needed." The studio fell completely silent except for the sound of people quietly crying. Jimmy felt his throat tighten with emotion at the profound reach of Margaret's advocacy. "Margaret," Jimmy said softly, "you didn't just substitute teach for 18 years, you became a guardian angel for students, an advocate for children who had no one else paying close enough attention to notice their needs." Margaret looked slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "Jimmy, I just did what any caring adult should do when they notice children struggling. I happened to be in a unique position where I could observe students objectively and had the knowledge to recognize when something wasn't quite right." She gestured toward her extensive documentation. "But what I learned is that most student problems are solvable if they're identified early enough. The challenge is that regular teachers are so busy managing their daily responsibilities that they sometimes miss subtle signs that an outsider might catch immediately." Margaret's voice grew more passionate. "Every child deserves to have an adult who really sees them, who notices when they're struggling or when they have hidden talents. I may have only been temporary in their classrooms, but I wanted to make permanent differences in their lives." Jimmy turned to address the camera directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret Chen didn't just fill in for absent teachers for 18 years. She became a secret advocate, a detective for student welfare, a voice for children who needed someone to notice they were more than they appeared to be." When the cameras finally stopped rolling, Margaret spent another hour with Jimmy, sharing more documentation and talking about her philosophy of advocacy and observation. "The thing is, Jimmy," Margaret said as they talked, "substitute teachers are often seen as temporary solutions to temporary problems. But children's needs aren't temporary. When you have the opportunity to observe students with fresh eyes, you have a responsibility to use that perspective to help them." 6 months later, Margaret published a guide titled "Seeing Students, a Substitute Teacher's Guide to Advocacy and Observation," sharing techniques for recognizing student needs, documenting concerns, and working within school systems to help children. All proceeds went to funding educational support programs for at-risk students. A year after her appearance, Margaret was invited to speak at a national conference of school counselors, where she was recognized for developing systematic approaches to student advocacy that had been adopted by substitute teacher programs nationwide. That Wednesday night, when Margaret Chen shared her story of secret advocacy with millions of viewers, she reminded everyone that every child deserves to have an adult who really sees them, who notices when they need help, and who cares enough to make sure that help arrives. Her messenger bag full of student files and her folder of success stories became symbols of what's possible when one person decides that temporary positions can create permanent change, and that the most important teaching sometimes happens not through lesson plans, but through careful observation, documentation, and advocacy for students who need someone to notice they matter.